Hello, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, and very warm welcome to our second installment of the Urban Futures Hub series. My name is Leila Niamir, a research scholar and leader of the Urban Futures Hub at the International Institute for Applied System Analyzing, IIASA, in Austria, and I'm delighted to open and moderate this session. You may have heard that the current IPCC assessment cycle includes a unique special report on cities and climate change. The work officially begins next month with the first lead authors meeting, and the report is expected to be finalized by March 27. Today, we want to take you behind the scenes, the process leading to the scoping of this report, outline agreement, and what we expected moving forward. We'll also discuss the important role of scientists, local governments, and practitioners in addressing climate challenges in cities, bridging science and policy to create meaningful changes. So we will discuss both from lens of science and local government and practitioners. With that, let me introduce our distinguished speakers who have been instrumental in shaping this report, which we are starting today, and we will continue. Will continue to guide us forward to this procedure. First, we have Professor Dr. Debra Roberts. Professor Dr. Roberts is a highly respected scientist with nearly 4 decades of experience bridging science, policy, practice at both local and international levels. She has led climate and environmental initiatives in South Africa and served as a co-chair of the IPCC Working Group 2 in the last cycle of assessment. Over the years, she has advised global organizations like UNFCCC and UN Habitat and have been recognized as one of the world's 100 most influential people in climate policy. She continues to shape the field as a coordinating lead author for the upcoming IPCC special report on cities. Our next speaker is Professor Şiir Kılkış, a vice chair of the IPCC Working Group 3 in current cycle. With over 20 years of experience, she is a senior researcher and science advisor at the Scientific and Technological Research Council of Turkey and a professor at Middle East Technical University. She is recognized among the top 2% of the scientists in energy and environmental sciences for her contribution in climate change mitigation. Most importantly, she is playing a key role as a review editor for the upcoming IPCC special report on cities. With that, I'm sure you all agree that we have a very special speakers today with us. A very warm welcome to you, dear Debra and Şiir, and thank you so much for accepting my invitation. Just few housekeeping notes. We will first hear from our speakers as a presentation. It's about around 25 minutes. We will follow by a Q&A and discussion about a 20-minute. The Q&A box is open for now, so feel free to add your question and as we are proceed through the presentations. Also, you have an opportunity to vote or rank other question in a box. Accordingly, we will pick up the question based on the popularity at the end and trying to answer them and discuss that. Now, let's hear from our esteemed speakers. Professor Kılkış, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Leila, for inviting us to this important webinar. I would like to start by sharing some insight into this process, leading up to this process and the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Cities. So the census report of the previous assessment emphasized urban systems as being critical for achieving deep emission reductions and advancing climate resilient development. And the role of inclusive long-term planning that takes an integrated approach was emphasized for urban transitions that offer benefits for mitigation, adaptation, human health and well-being, ecosystem services, and vulnerability reduction for low-income communities. I would like to go a little bit more into the mitigation perspective, and the importance of urban areas in the global context is also evident based on the global share of emissions that can be attributed to urban areas that is increasing. In 2015, this share of CO2 and methane emissions was about 62% of the global share, and in 2020, this was 67 to 72% of the global share, so it is increasing. And the drivers of urban greenhouse gas emissions are complex and include population size, income, city urbanization, and urban form. So urban futures are closely related also to climate futures. And at the same time, when we compare the urban per capita consumption-based CO2 equivalent emissions and the national per capita CO2 equivalent emissions, the urban ones are shown with the blue dashed bars. And we can see that when these values are compared to the national per capita emissions in green dash bars, these are lower in 5 of the 6 regions. So based on multiple lines of evidence and many others, from mitigation perspective, urban areas can create opportunities to increase resource efficiency and significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions through the systemic transition of infrastructure and urban form that go together through low emission development pathways towards net zero emissions. One of these options in different contexts, of course, can be compact and walkable urban form that can have many co-benefits, including co-located jobs and housing, mental and physical health, lower resource demand, and saving land for agriculture, forestry, and other land use that can also support food security. And when we look also into the different layers that can go into urban systems, land use, whatever the patterns are closely linked with transportation, mobility, buildings, providing shelter, and energy, including energy access. So whatever one is done in one layer impacts the other. So for example, better urban planning can increase service provisioning for mobility and shelter. And the linkages of urban areas to others in the world, in the region, and also their interactions with natural resources is evident throughout the world. So trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in one location will also consider taking a perspective into many others around the world. The linkages of urban mitigation options, as assessed in the previous assessment, is also important. There are linkages with sustainable development goals. So for example, measures promoting walkable urban areas combined with electrification and renewable energy can create health co-benefits from cleaner air and benefits from enhanced mobility. A cross-working group collaboration for cities and climate change, looking towards the special report on climate change in cities, also emphasized that the diversity of cities' experiences of climate mitigation adaptation strategies brings an advantage for those city governments and other actors willing to learn together. So there's a great potential for cities to learn from one another, their different challenges, their different contexts, and to exchange their experiences. Already an attempt to bring together different case studies of integrated policy making for sector transitions included urban policy making and mobility from various contexts, such as a coordination mechanism in Shanghai, African electromobility in Kampala, and a shift in mobility service provision in Kolkata. And what these showed was trying to achieve multiple social benefits and trying to also shift perceptions of public transport were important. Of course, there were different policy mixes involved, objectives, and governance contexts, including the different enablers and barriers. Bringing together expertise, not only from mitigation, but across all 3 working groups, the physical science bases, impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, and mitigation of climate change, the scoping meeting that took place in April of last year also brought together scientists and practitioners, exactly 140 experts from 65 countries. And as you can imagine, this process that has been trying to be initiated over many years has widespread expectations and interest across the world. After the scoping, this took place directly in between the 60th session of the IPCC that confirmed that a special report on climate change and cities will be provided in early 2027, and the 61st session of the IPCC that took place in Sofia, Bulgaria, that looked into the scoped outline, its agreement with governments. After all of these processes, starting from Istanbul, Riga, and Sofia, the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Cities is initiating. I would like to provide you and guide a little bit our participants here on the agreed outline of the special report that has 5 chapters in addition to a glossary. Let me guide through the decision on the outline of the special report on climate change and cities that's publicly available and openly available on the website, and guide you through the agreed outline as chapters and the indicative bullets. So based on the agreed outline, the first chapter will provide the integrated storyline of the report, chapter narrative, sequence, and linkages to other relevant processes and assessments. It will provide a framing and definition of urban systems and settlements and their regional climatic characteristics, sustainable development and climate resilience, acknowledging diversity of development status of cities and countries, cities as hotspots of effects of hazards and emissions, losses and damages, vulnerabilities, exposure and impacts, while also being key climate actors, framing of multi-dimensional urban characteristics, including physical, socioeconomic, and environmental features, and many others that are also treated across the entire report. These include a treatment of urban vulnerabilities, marginalized areas and people, gender equity and formality and justice, psychology, perception, behavior, and attitudes towards climate change and cities, interconnection between local context and global context and between urban and rural systems, assessment methodologies including following a regional approach, diverse knowledge systems including indigenous knowledge, practitioner expertise, city networks, and considered timeframes and spatial scales. With this framing, the second chapter will look into cities in a changing climate with the trends, challenges, and opportunities. It will provide a diagnostic of understanding and learning from the past, as well as past, current, and future global and city-specific climate with the trends, means, and extremes. It will look into urbanization, urban service, common and different urban development trends, urban emission trends, including consumption-based emissions, the role of cities in emissions and mitigation, future global and city-level scenarios, considering local options, equity, sustainable development, infrastructure, and informal settlements, as well as city-specific risks and their global and regional climatic impact drivers. Continuing, there are other indicative bullets that the author teams will be considering. Current mitigation adaptation, planned and unplanned relocation, loss and damages experienced and the socioeconomic trends that shape them, including policy, governance, and colonialization. Understanding the two-way interaction, feedback between cities, regions, and countries, data, uncertainty, as well as complexity and the need to contextualize the climate change within the broader societal trends. Coming to chapter 3, this is focused on actions and solutions to reduce urban risks and emissions. It will look specifically into common and context-specific urban mitigation options, common and context-specific urban mitigation and disaster risk reduction options, evaluation of city actions across mitigation and adaptation, urban observation and modeling tools for monitoring and evaluation of sectors and unaccounted sources, local risk assessments using scientific information, indigenous knowledge, and local knowledge of impacts, types and scale of adaptation responses, and adaptation cycles in various regions and contexts, integrating mitigation adaptation into sustainable development and just transitions, metrics for assessing mitigation adaptation options in the context of sustainable development and the characteristics of and within cities, including service provisioning that delivers health and well-being for all, as well as case studies, best practices, stories related to climate resilient development, adaptation, decarbonization, and low-carbon development in a diverse range of cities. Chapter 4 focuses on the how to facilitate and accelerate change, looking into new ways of planning, providing climate and information services to enable action, innovation and governance, urban planning policies, decision-making, technology, urban service provisioning, energy access and shelter, infrastructure, social systems and finance, including adoption of innovation, facilitation of societal trends, acknowledging diverse capacities, institutional capacities, competencies, inclusive multi-level governance, and many others that the author teams will be providing the assessments based on the evidence. This also includes indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, diverse knowledge systems and values, policies for behavioral and lifestyle changes, finance, financial instruments, and many others. This will also include the holistic planning and systems thinking approach towards decarbonized and climate resilient cities, structural inequity, enabling conditions for poverty eradication, equity and just transitions, political will, as well as conflicting goals and trade-offs. The synthesis of solution-relevant information and a collection of case studies, as you can imagine, diversity of topics that will be covered throughout the report will need some kind of a synthesis in the context of urban sustainable development. And this is the home of Chapter 5, Solutions by City Types and Regions. It will be distinguished by multidimensional characteristics such as geographical location, development stage, informality, city climate projections, climatic impact drivers, adaptation and mitigation options, sectoral contributions to the economy, migration, fragility, loss and damages, early warning systems, capacities, inclusiveness, equity and justice, governance, as well as climate finance. The time schedule that is agreed also by the panel will initiate with the first lead author meeting. Already 97 experts from 56 countries have been selected. There were many other very distinguished expertise that could not be involved directly as lead authors. But from the start of the first lead author meeting until the end of the process, there's exactly 740 days of an intensive writing, reviewing, and iterations. So it's a very exciting process ahead. I would also like to end with providing some of the context of how the results of the special report. First, it needs to inspire the climate action at the local level, but also in their national context. So, for example, this is showing a map from UN Habitat of how much urban content is currently located or takes place in the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. And as you can see, there's a range across the world. And considering the target audience of the special report is also the local governments, in addition to the national, regional, and the entire global stakeholders. So it's a very high expectation. So with this, I would like to emphasize that urban areas will continue to have increasing roles in the mitigation and adaptation of climate change. The mitigation options that will be covered, the urban adaptation options that will be covered, will have a very promising role in how our urban futures are shaped and how our climate futures are shaped. So with this, in the context of the key role of urban areas for addressing climate change, let me also emphasize that scientists, governments, and practitioners jointly share urgent responsibilities in supporting urban areas. So thank you, Leila, for the invitation, and Debra, I look forward to conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Şiir. It's a great to hear all this information and a lot food for thought and discussion. So now you hear from the lens of the science, and we have Debra here to look through this perspective from the practitioners and local government perspective. I'm very much looking forward for your presentation. Floor is yours.
Thanks, Leila. Just getting that. Great. And thanks, Şiir, another great presentation. I always really enjoy your presentations. They're so thorough and to the point. My job is to put on a different hat. I certainly have a relationship with the IPCC of the last 2 assessment cycles. But today I'm bringing the other aspect of my life. I'll be offering a practitioner's viewpoint on the challenges and opportunities of the special report that Şiir has just taken us through so very thoroughly. The first thing, any practitioner will ask when they're told that a special report on cities has been written by the IPCC is going to be, well, why is this thing special? You must remember that practitioners are absolutely bombarded from every corner of the world, from every level of government with guidebooks and suggestions and policies. So what makes this stand out in a very busy crowd for practitioners? I think for me, this will be the first IPCC report that really has a human face to it, that people will be able to identify with, because we're speaking about the place that the majority of us live, we work, we play. And for many around the world, particularly in the global south, cities hold out that aspiration that a better life is still possible. So I think because we're more able to closely identify with cities than we are, for example, a special report on cryosphere, people might see this as standing out in the crowd. The problem is because cities concentrate people, money, power, politics, and infrastructure, they're also the places where the urgency of the climate change challenge really manifests itself, the vulnerability of urban areas, the impacts that they're experiencing. But at the same time, cities also contain a great deal of agency. This is where leaders live, where decisions are taken about what infrastructure is built, where resources go. And I've lost track of the number of times various world leaders, from the UN Secretary General to others, have said that we fundamentally win or lose the climate battle in terms of what is done in the world's cities. But as a practitioner, and I've spent 30 years working in local government in Africa, we're realists at the end of the day. And while we may feel that this special report is really special, for people who are actually working on the ground in the trenches at the coal faces, they're facing so many pressures at this point in time. Political instability, poverty, unemployment, conflict, informality, biodiversity loss, migration, limited resources. And so the hard reality on the ground is, while this special report may be special, certainly in terms of the climate change community, we've got to recognize that in the real world, climate change is not always a priority for everyone, particularly not always a priority for practitioners and local government officials or civic society organizations. So if we want to raise a flag and say this thing is really special, what do we need to be doing? Well, it's about action, action, action. That's the byline for practitioners, because our job is implementation. Our job is to do things in the real world. So what that says about the special report is you've got to be focusing on the what and the how. We spent 36 years learning about the why. I really don't need to know more about the why. What I need to know is what and how I need to be doing. And this is a really important message that we as the authors will need to take away. We simply cannot produce an encyclopedia of everything that is known about cities and climate change science, because practitioners will simply not read that. We do not need that information. As interesting as it may be to our scientific colleagues, what we need pulled out from the literature is an assessment of the most policy relevant, most practice relevant aspects related to the climate change challenge and how we might begin to respond to that. And it's not only about producing a shopping list of, hey, practitioners, here's a range of things you can go out and do. We need to advance the work that was begun in AR6 around feasibility and effectiveness. We need to know what works where, in what geography, at what scales. And simply, this report can't shy away from the fact that it needs to also look at the social, the political, and institutional context, because very often that context influences what cities can do. Practitioners are also all about show me the money. You know, if you're going to do stuff, it generally costs, and it generally costs quite a lot. So this special report will also need to access the literature to really understand the financial requirements of local level action to materialize and give effect to that huge potential that Şiir has just taken us through. We will need access to resources, how much, where, and what are the costs of inaction. We've also got to be really realistic when we're drafting this report about really acknowledging that there is an assessment and reality gap. And this always struck me during the course of AR6. I would go to the IPCC meetings and they're very formal, they're clinical, they're sanitized. You know, in formal surroundings, you'll have discussions, some of which are quite politically heated often, but it bears absolutely no relationship to the real world. So I would leave the IPCC meetings, I would go home and I'd find myself in informal settlements where the path I'm standing on isn't even as wide as my body, where there's raw sewage flowing over my feet along that path, and where there are exposed power cables that are killing children in the informal settlements. So the IPCC process is very remote from the real world. And if this report is going to be successful, it's going to have to come down. It's going to have to find a way of telling the story about those everyday experiences across the world. And it's particularly going to have to talk to the experiences of the cities in the global south or the majority world, because that's where the bulk of this urbanization is happening. And it's a very different form of urbanization to what we've seen in Europe and North America. We've also got to put the development back in climate change. What concerns me as someone who spans the worlds of practice and science is we've got so busy talking about an invisible gas that no one can see and so obsessed with carbon, we've forgotten about development. And that has really consequences for the special report. It's going to have to use the literature to assess the role of basic development within the climate change response. And it's particularly going to have to look at that in the context of these small, very rapidly urbanizing, often informal urban centers of the global south. Because the fact of the matter is, if you look at the 21st century, who are the most important city builders in the century? It's those billion people living in informal settlements, largely across the global south, who are basically saying, your development choices do not work for us. We're going to vote with our feet. We're going to build cities within cities to meet our needs. And bear in mind that 1 billion today is probably going to be on the order of 3 billion, according to UN Habitat, by the middle of the century. So we get by the middle of the century a tipping point no one is talking about in the scientific literature. 3 billion people living in informal settlements and a world of overshoot of 1.5, a world of possibly of overshoot of 2. We don't have a toolbox for that world. And so that's a critical thing to look at. But we're also talking not only about development that provides clean water, sanitation, safe homes, but a development path that brings with it equity and justice. And as much as the terms equity and justice are now being politicized, the only way you get to the just transitions that Sarah pointed, are such a key part of the assessment of Chapter 3, is if you get cities to help you bend the curve, not only on carbon dioxide emissions, but also on vulnerability, on poverty and inequity. So they are a key tool for a just and equitable world. And that does still remain a priority for the majority of us. We also cannot be politically blind or naive in the authoring of this report. If you look at a lot of the media coming out around climate change, we've got a very strong focus, and not surprisingly so, on extreme events, on chronic events. My experience as a practitioner, both in the South African context, but also working with other colleagues on the African continent and other parts of the global South, is that cities really do recover much more rapidly from floods, droughts, and storms than they do from political and economic shocks. And that is the reality. So my experience is that political priorities will almost always trump scientific priorities. And I suppose we're seeing that in action at the moment. And so we really do need to understand not only the physical context of our cities, but the political economy of those cities and how those political economies influence decisions around the climate change response. And recognize that political economy is not only located in a city's geography, but is often controlled from other places, either in the nation state or the international community. So it's a complex system. To me, one of the big revelations of this year has been reading IPBES's, so the biodiversity equivalent of the IPCC Transformative Change Assessment. And it's the first time I've read in a global assessment a really brutal and honest assessment of the challenges and barriers to action. The biodiversity community has actually pulled the curtain aside and said, you've got to think about relationships of domination. You've got to think about colonialism. You've got to think about economic and political inequalities, unfit institutions. They've really not pulled any of their punches on this. And for me, reading this report and thinking about what the IPCC does in the 7th assessment cycle, I think that the IPCC is as a crossroads. It's, if it does not respond to the kind of challenge that IPBES has laid out for us in picking up that messaging in its assessments, I fear that it will be made irrelevant by the progress that's been made by IPBES. And so I think there's a very real challenge in this special report. And so my message one is really of radical reality. We've got to get used to the fact that science is often subservient to politics, particularly in the world's cities. We've got to get real, that we're facing new challenges we've never faced before. We've got to grapple with this increasing dissonance around the target of 1.5. You've got global leaders wandering around the world saying we've got to keep 1.5 alive, where quite frankly, the reality is we're almost all there. If you look at the work that's been done in the first State of the Health of the Planet report, they're saying we're going to cross 1.5 in the next 5 years. Somehow no one wants to talk about this, but we've got to in cities because of the expanded risk landscape that will bring. If you look at the NDCs and look at many of the climate response plan of cities, a lot of them include nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based adaptation. But in AR6, we showed that as one moves into 1.5 overshoot, the first thing that's going to be impacted will be your natural ecosystems, particularly those at risk. So your warm-water corals, coastal wetlands, many coastal cities are relying on those to increase their adaptive capacity, your rainforest, your mountain and polar ecosystems. So what happens when nature's not there or doesn't function as well during a period of overshoot? And so from a practitioner point of view, I think we need a new plan A for the world's cities that's fit for purpose in the suboptimal world where we're not meeting these global targets. Climate, biodiversity, SDGs, because we've got to prevent the cities becoming the world's largest stranded assets. And that takes me back to where I started. This special report has to focus on the what and the how. The IPCC can't keep doing the same thing and expect different outcomes. We've got to move away from this focus on the why. We've got enough understanding around the why. We've got to know what and how needs to be done. And this assessment hopefully will provide an opportunity to look at that in detail. We need to move to a theory of action. Forget the theory of change. We need a theory of action. We need to figure out what people from the practitioner community need to be doing. And that often means that we've got to be honest about what is in the literature. Practitioners don't have time to write scientific papers. It's not part of their job description. And so very often the scientific literature is way behind where the practice currently is at. Practitioners are doing things, local communities are living.
At the same time,
I'm getting feedback. So practice is often well ahead of the scientific literature. So we have to find ways of accessing that knowledge. That means expanding what the IPCC regards as relevant literature. It does have the ability to look at grey literature, but we need a much more focused look beyond the models, beyond the IAMs, to the real world dynamics that drive action and actually limit it. And so, this is a big challenge for this assessment cycle in paperwork that's going to P62, currently 62nd panel meeting. The IPCC itself acknowledges the problem of publications doubling virtually in every assessment cycle. And so there'll be a real challenge to those 97 authors. And I'm almost beginning to wonder why I put my name forward for that. But this is a critical moment. This is why people like myself put our names forward. It's because it's a critical moment. The international community is looking more and more at cities. We saw that at the last 3 COPs with the urban ministerials. We've got the CHAMP initiative drawing nation states around a table with their local governments. It's a critical scientific moment. For the first time, I think the IPCC will have to get real. It'll have to come down to the local level where the action is at. But it's also an important moment to think beyond the production of this report. How do you get this important information, if we do get the what and the how out there, out to practitioners to use? And for me, that raises questions around what happens to the summary for urban policymaker initiatives from AR6, which did that in the last assessment cycle. Are we thinking enough about that? So those are a couple of thoughts that I hope will help stimulate some conversation going forward.
Excellent. Many thanks, Debra. It's a lot of information and food for thoughts and discussion. I'm so excited about that. Maybe I just want to add a few things that maybe it would be helpful for also our audience, is that basically this city report is a combination of IPCC has a different kind of working groups on adaptation, mitigation, and climate science, and basically this city report is a combination of the all working groups and all expertise that could collaborate on that, and it's a great opportunity that we hear from the different expertise and thoughts around it. We can start with the Q&A, but still I don't have any question on board. Feel free to bring, but I also have a question from you, because this is very important. I mean, important job that we should do, and we already discussed why is important to do. So I'm not going through that, but for reaching to what and how, basically what coming from the Debra presentation, and then lots of topics and heterogeneity that we have around cities. I mean, all the cities are very, very different. In some places we have lots of information, in some places not. And then from the perspective that we are giving, what you should do and how you should do is very different. How we can tackle that, or how we can have a better assessment, or basically come up with better assessment to be practical for any type of cities that we have around the world.
You just want us to come in as
please. Yeah, please.
Maybe I could kick that one off. So, I mean, I think the first important point to note is that within the 97 authors, 5 are people we as the urban practitioner network regard as urban practitioners. So people who have been involved in the planning and management of cities. So I think that's an important source of information, but those 5 are connected to the big city networks. So the big city networks have been meeting around the special report because they understand the significance of it. And hopefully we'll be in a position whereby the 5 practitioners who are part of the actual author team will be able to reach back to the networks to pull out as much information as is possible where case studies are needed in places of the world that are perhaps more difficult to access through literature in the peer-reviewed press. So I think that's going to be important, is creating up those knowledge flows that allow us to bring some of this information from the practitioner community through into the assessment space, so that the authors can look at it, see if it's useful as part of their assessment. So I think that's important, and certainly the practitioners come from different parts of the world, the 5 that are involved. So hopefully that will allow us to also deal with those areas where there'll be more difficulty in accessing knowledge.
Şiir, would you like to add anything here?
Of course. So I think it's a very important question. I think it also goes back to how we see the target audience of the special report. So a lot of local governments, they're very dedicated to whoever we're speaking, mayors, their city leaders. They are very, very concerned about climate change. They want to do something about it, and they exactly want to know the how and what to do. So I think the scientific evidence that the author team provides here, together with the practical insights, will be very important to empower those local governments. They're looking for ways to build their capacity. They're looking into ways they can strengthen their institutions. They're looking into ways they can strengthen their climate governments, because they realize that what they do for their people now will have a very big difference. And I would also like to go back to the statistic that 39% of nationally determined contributions have moderate urban content. 34% have low or no urban content, and only 27% have strong urban elements. So this is also an opportunity for the special report to empower the local governments to communicate with the national governments, to strengthen that multi-level governments, to say there's a very big opportunity. National governments can support urban areas more. Urban areas can support the climate targets. They can support the net zero targets. They can support climate resilience. What national governments see for their future will also involve what they see for their urban areas. How are they going to provide the increased service provisioning to the people for mobility and shelter? Is this going to go with the same way, or is it going to also consider some of the new opportunities, the new resources out there? So it's a very big opportunity to engage that entire network of actors, local government, city networks, and providing both the scientific assessment and the practical insights. So I think what the experts agreed with the scope outline that brings together all of those 5 chapters, I think is a very promising structure for the special report. It's capturing many of the needs. It's addressing, trying to look into solutions by city types in chapter 5. It's trying to go into actions in chapter 3, the how in chapter 4. So I think all of these needs that have been resonating throughout the community through the years has been captured in the scoped outline. I'm very excited to see what the author teams will come up with in addressing those indicative bullets.
Excellent. We have a follow-up question. I mean, how people or practitioners could also kind of submitting or bringing these case studies to the awareness of the lead authors. Maybe you can a little bit talk about the review process that they can also involve more. Şiir, could you add that? How they can bring their materials to our process?
The review process is an excellent way to start engaging with the IPCC. There are multiple rounds of review process. I showed in the timeline. It's also on the website. But through those lead author meetings, it's always a period of writing, and time for reviewing and for the reiteration. So it's a very interactive process. So the entire scientific community, the entire practitioner community, and all of them together have the opportunity to register as being reviewers. So once the first order draft is out, IPCC will make an announcement that the review is open to provide comments for the first order draft. And at that point, experts can register to review the first order draft, and it will go into the second order draft and so forth. But it's an open process. IPCC is very sensitive to ensuring the engagement with the entire broader community. And there's also, so the lead authors have been selected, coordinating lead authors have been selected, review editors have been selected. Contributing authors will be determined according to the needs that arise in the process. So those are not determined, but usually it's a very specific expertise area that is seen to be missing, upon which those will be decided by the leadership. So that's still a process for people to contribute, but so beyond those more formal processes, of course, publishing, trying to get the case studies out, trying to assess the scientific literature that benefits the process, trying to put more insights in there, more evidence out there. So all of that is a big process in itself, and just look out if you're a practitioner, maybe collaborate with your university. You know, I'm teaching a course on sustainable development. I have many students from international context, and they are trying to use opportunities to connect with the local context, their ministries, trying to provide what they're learning in the universities into practice and a solution-oriented process. So it's more about collaboration, it's more about partnerships.
Excellent, thank you, Şiir. We have a next question approaching to Debra. Would you please also, Debra, elaborate a little bit on that question about the nature-based solution perspective?
Sure. So just for people listening in, the question is about nature-based solutions and my indication that they would be under pressure as we move into overshoot. And the question relates to, you know, what happens then, because hard engineering solutions often fail and don't have additional co-benefits. You know, what kind of alternative solutions are there? I think it's exactly that sort of question that I'm hoping to provoke. And certainly I've spent 40 years of my life driving a nature-based solutions approach to urban planning and the challenges we faced in the city that I work in. But I think the new pressures of overshoot mean that we've got to start talking about what happens when those ecosystem services either disappear or are not delivered in the same form, or the ecosystems themselves change, to think about how to manage that new risk landscape. And that could be as different as having to rely, for example, where an ecosystem service is totally removed. So let's assume a city has a coastal barrier of mangroves to protect it from storm surge, and the mangroves, for whatever reason, because of overshoot and other pressures, are no longer viable. There you'll probably have to come in with some kind of grey infrastructure. But what kind of grey infrastructure? How do you use grey infrastructure in a way that keeps options open? Can there be replacements for that ecosystem? You know, can you use new ecosystems to provide that opportunity? Can you make grey infrastructure do multiple things, not only protect, but act as a source of a sink for carbon? Because if you think about moving into a world of overshoot and potentially having to deal with massive carbon dioxide removal, these are difficult questions. We've not had these discussions before. And that, for me as a practitioner, is something we need to challenge the practitioner community to do. So, you know, you may have access to ecosystem-based adaptation for the next 20 years, but if that changes, what do you do after that and still keep the development of your city being sustainable, equitable, and just, and contributing to climate change response? So I don't think there are any ready answers here, but these are important questions that are emerging from the changing context that we need to deal with. I'd also just like to pick up on the question around, well, how do practitioners get their information into the IPCC machine? As I've said, there's been a mobilization of the broad-scale city networks on the outside. So UN Habitat, GCOM, ICLEI, C40, all have an interest, obviously, in the special report. And most cities have a link to one of those networks. So my strong suggestion would be for you to reach back into the urban networks that are most prevalent in your cities, in order to get that information recorded as case studies and put out potentially by that city network. And that, for me, is an important message. This is not only a place where, and I was frightened by Şiir's outlining of the number of hours that or days that we have to work on this, but the practitioner community now needs to mobilize to get that information recorded and put out. So, for example, Cities Alliance is busy working on pulling all their information on informality together so that it's readily accessible to the authors. So there needs to be mobilization in the practitioner-aligned networks as well to get that information recorded and put out there. A very useful process is the UCERN process of collecting case studies, their docking stations. So there's initiatives through UCERN as well. So important for you to find the route either through the city networks or other initiatives to get your information recorded.
Perfect. Thank you. Maybe also I add something here. Also, maybe it's also part of our as a scientist or researcher to reach out also to practitioners and try to bridge these gaps. I really love the quote that you said that in some cases the practitioners are much ahead of us. I mean, they will not wait for us to do the evaluation. They might come because of the urgency. They come with their own solution, and turns out that is the best practice actually that happening like that. And also from my perspective, I also would like to discover more and go through these practitioners and local government to understand what they do and how they solve the issues, and basically make a connection better to the scientist from the perspective of the governance lens. And this would be a little bit sometimes difficult because as we know that we are in a global setting and we have a different languages, and sometimes the language or all the materials in a different languages would be difficult. But this might be also the one way that have a better collaboration between scientists and practitioners to bring all this great knowledge to the assessment, and for also learning from would be a learning process for other cities as well. Meanwhile, that some of the question will answers by colleagues. So maybe then I will go to Şiir. Maybe there was a question about that. You also presented about the outline of the agreement, outline agreement of this report. The question, it was a trade-off between mitigation and adaptation. How much do we have, and how much we are putting effort on it? Could you just quickly answer that?
Yes, of course. So it's cross-cutting across actually all the chapters. It's cities in the context of a changing climate. And that will be the main central focus throughout the report as a cross-cutting area. But I think the trade-offs between mitigation and adaptation, so also coming from the previous assessments, just showing the sheer number, the percentage, the share of urban emissions in the global total is overwhelming. And there are perhaps cities that are can be attributed more the emissions, but it's putting the central message that if urban areas across the world are not buckling up really the measures to strengthen their mitigation efforts, and they are trying to do this, but it's impacting the climate change of the entire world, and the vulnerabilities and inequities are increasing because of this. So in that challenging context, it's really a challenge also for the special report to find scientific evidence to provide and strengthen the toolbox that cities can take to reduce the emissions for practically the benefit of the entire world and the benefit of the entire ecosystems. So already in the previous assessments, the limits adaptation, so there are both soft and hard limits to that, with each temperature level of global warming. So whatever that I just shared in the presentation is about 70%, 67 to 72% in 2020. So that is the share of contributions that urban areas have been making to also the climate change issue that we have. So the special report needs to find that balance of providing the scientific evidence to allow urban areas to upscale their mitigation efforts, how to do that in an integrative way while addressing opportunities for mitigation, trying to provide better service provisioning to people so the solutions are sustainable. So in that context, the trade-off between mitigation and adaptation, it's there at the global level, but perhaps even more for the urban level, and that will be assessed according to the indicative bullets in the agreed outline.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm just looking through the question from Francis. We already, Debra already covered that when she was describing about the collaboration and co-authoring and co-design. But we have other question regarding to the risk solutions to risk and emissions that might be also Debra could cover that. Maybe you can say a little bit about it, Debra. That would be great.
Sure. So that's a question for those who are not looking at the Q&A, is we can look at solutions and actions, but they are going to be impacted by a whole range of limitless and possibly antithetic forces. I like that phrasing, which originate from aspects that are beyond technocratic considerations. How do we deal with this in tandem with accurate use of the IPCC calibrated language? I don't think there's a problem in using the calibrated language. I think where the real problem comes from is that we are not looking, which is why I provided the best example of an assessment, which has actually thrown open the doors on the full context of what operates in a decision-making realm, and looked at that complexity, the economic, the political, the social. And I think it's that narrative that perhaps we've not seen as well developed in IPCC reports. Not surprising. I mean, the IPCC work really started off in the natural sciences. It's only been in the latter day assessments that the social and the political sciences are seeing more of the light of day. And I think the answer to that one is we've got to pull through that literature. And, a big question for me is how many political scientists do we actually have in the author team to help us understand these dynamics, and the kind of certainty or uncertainty they may bring into decision-making or resource allocation. Then you can use the calibrated language relatively easily. But for me, it's the foundational information. We need to reach out to new forms of sciences. When we talk about science, it's not only the natural and physical, it has to be the social, it has to be the political, because these are the things, and we've seen it over the last couple of weeks, that are fundamentally driving a new momentum. So that for me is important, is reading that story out there. I think using the calibrated language is, less of a problem once you do that.
Thank you, Debra. Also, I just want to link to other question that basically it's you have a better experience on that in NDCs based particularly in developed countries. We have a less or very little knowledge or materials on the urban studies. Why is that, and how we can basically improve that for the in the future? Basically, is one of the questions that we received from attendees.
Yeah, I mean, I don't lay any claim to great insight into the minds of national governments, but I think, and this is probably something that affects the IPCC as much as it does the UNFCCC, is that for a lot of these debates around the big global environmental and developmental challenges, a lot of them have been urban blind. And so the power was seen to rest in the nation state. So you had a post-Second World War world order that privileged the role of the nation state in resource allocation and decision making. So all of our systems have been geared towards the national, international level when it's come to dealing with these crises. I mean, one of the biggest frustrations I had over the many years of my career is when I went to the COPs, the climate COPs, as a local government official, I had to register alongside the indigenous communities, the research communities, the farmers, and so on, because local government isn't recognized as a sphere of government within these big processes. So you've got a structural problem. The local is not recognized as anything other than a major group. It's not recognized as local government. But then I think there are politics in the room. There are many places in the world, for example, where you've got a situation of primate cities where the country has one very large urban area, and that urban area, for example, is under the control of an opposition party. So, just in terms of political livelihoods, it doesn't serve the politics in many instances to recognize another sphere of government, which, if the science comes out and says, look, this is really important, you need to resource it more, give it more power, we need to see more subsidiarity, that's going to work against a political economy in some cases. So I think it's a complex mix of structural problems in the United Nations and international system. I think there are political problems in that regard. I think there's real capacity problems, you know, in many of the smaller urban centers. In Africa, for example, they're informal. They don't have traditional forms of governance and so on. So how would they act? You know, who would support that? So I think it's a very complex process, but in this changing world, I think we need to be talking about these challenges, and is the status quo fit for purpose in dealing, for example, a world that's going to face a tipping point of 3 billion people in informal settlements and 1.5 or 2 degree overshoot? I suspect not.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We have one more question. We have time for one more question that we have that is coming from that. How do you think it will be to break mitigation, adaptation, sustainability, and development thinking silos? The outline does seems to be integrative, but science is still solid. And then basically how this would be very important challenge for authors. How basically is your approach on that? Maybe Şiir, could you elaborate a little bit on it? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So the world is going in this direction, or trying to go in this direction. So it's an opportunity again for the special report to address this. And just to give a practical insight, the COP29 this year took the Declaration on Multi-Sectoral Action Pathways, MAP, to Resilient Healthy Cities. So this has been one of the processes that I've tried to uplift and have the urban emphasized at the international level. So in these multi-sectoral action pathways to resilient and healthy cities, all of the mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development aspects are emphasized. So if the author teams, they're looking into literature and they still see it's siloed, well, they do have to assess the scientific literature, they do have to look into the practitioner information, but they also have to synthesize. Or at least try to synthesize as much as possible and be honest of what information is able to be synthesized and what are knowledge gaps or uncertainties related to that. So I would like to end or conclude my contribution by reading two of the indicative bullets that relate to mitigation adaptation of climate change. So it's coming from the agreed outline, common and context-specific urban mitigation options for spatial planning, energy, covering heating, cooling, electricity, existing and new buildings and infrastructure, mobility and transport, water, land, food, demand-side measures and behavioral change, and cross-sectoral integrated approaches in urban systems such as circularity. It's also emphasizing common and context-specific urban adaptation and disaster risk reduction options for managing risks in natural, ecological, and human systems, including but not limited to physical infrastructure, urban nature-based solutions, and ecosystem-based adaptation, and planning on social policies such as relocation, health systems, and early warning systems. So as you can imagine, there's an entire literature, scientific literature, and practitioner information out there that this information needs to be gathered, assessed. So it's trying to assess the scientific literature, considering their common and context specific characteristics, and also trying to synthesize. So that will be discussed more and more in the time schedule that I've shown you. And there will be iterations of reviews and different processes throughout that process. But as I said, it's a real opportunity for cities to look into ways they can address mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development, considering their specific contexts.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Just looking through the clock, actually, it's very interesting to see all these discussions. I just want to ask you the last favor that maybe in just very briefly, just give us the last remark. I mean, in your perspective about this report, or what you would like to give the message to our audience or future audience that watching this later in the YouTube. Maybe Debra, you can start.
Okay. Well, I suppose the big message from me is business as usual is not going to cut it. I think it is important that the special report starts a new conversation with a new perspective that is responsive to 21st century realities, not 20th century realities. And so I think it's be brave, get stories told, get them out into the literature, grey or peer reviewed through partnerships. And let's make sure that the special report actually tells the story of what is happening on the ground, but also looks to the future and the changing context. For me, the big herd of elephants in the room is overshoot. No one wants to talk about it or its implications. And I'm hoping this will crack open the door on that.
Perfect. Şiir?
Thank you. So the agreed outline of the special report on climate change in cities does represent the process thus far and guiding the process going forward. So I would encourage the entire scientific practitioners, city networks, national governments to really study the outline and find ways that they can contribute into that messages, into the evidence base, and trying to put the whatever that their city can offer. So every city has a particular story that they can tell, a particular experience that they can share, a particular community that they can seek support to have their story and voice heard. So I would encourage all cities, big and small, wherever it is around the world, all the voice of all cities matter and the voices of all experiences matter. So we need to solve this climate challenge together. What we do now for mitigation, what we do now for adaptation, what we do now for sustainable development will shape generations to come. And this is real. I mean, what we do now will impact the lives of people in the future, the lives of the beings, the natural beings out there in the world. So we need to take on this responsibility. So the lead authors there, the coordinating lead authors, they have undertaken and signed under this responsibility, but it's also up to the entire city networks, the cities to support them by providing their evidence and support actually the entire world to address climate change because it's shaping our future.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I really appreciate our wonderful speakers, Debra and Şiir, for sharing your thoughts, insight, and expertise. Always, I will learn from you both, and I believe that everyone also had the same things. And big thank to our audience for joining, engaging in our discussion. Last but not least, we would like to hear from your thoughts. If you possible, just take a moment and fill out our survey that let us know what topic or which type of speakers you would like to see in the future of this Urban Futures Hub series. And again, thank you so much for all your collaborations and your participation. And again, thank you so much, Debra and Şiir, for being here and joining us and your presence. Thanks again, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in next time. I'm closing this session. Thank you and bye-bye.